Honourable members, the prayer. Lord, the God of righteousness and truth, grant to our Queen and to her government, to members of the Legislative Assembly and to all in positions of responsibility, the guidance of your Spirit. May they never lead the province wrongly through love of power, desire to please, or unworthy ideas, but laying aside all private interests and prejudice, keep in mind their responsibility to seek to improve the condition of all. Amen. Please be seated. Honourable members, we are at orders of the day, orders du jour. The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to request unanimous consent of the Assembly that members may be able to sit, speak, and vote from any chair within the Assembly for today's sitting.
Members, the Deputy Government House Leader has requested unanimous consent for members to be able to sit, vote, and speak from any seat in the Assembly for the remainder of the day. I will ask only one question. Is there anyone opposed to providing consent? If so, please do so now. Hearing none, unanimous consent is granted.
Under Government Bills and Orders, for second reading, Bill 8, Protecting Survivors of Human Trafficking Act. Honourable Mr. Schweitzer.
The Honourable, the Minister of Justice and the Solicitor General.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to move second reading of Bill 8, the Protecting Survivors of Human Trafficking Act. Human trafficking is a dehumanizing and predatory crime that violates a person's most basic human rights and dignity. Traffickers prey upon people of all ages, ethnicities, and genders. They coerce their victims into providing labor or sexual services against their will. Traffickers often use threats of violence against the survivor and their loved ones to trap them in a cycle of exploitation. This crime is often unconsciously ignored by the general public. Albertans think that human trafficking is something that happens somewhere else. The truth is that it happens in our own communities, and sometimes it happens at the business or house next door. I'm proud to stand with a government who refuses to sit idly by and allow this abuse to go unchecked in Alberta. This legislation will strengthen a survivor's ability to get away from them physically, emotionally, financially, without damaging them as much as possible. This legislation will allow us to create an annual day, February 22nd, to bring awareness to the issue of human trafficking. A standard definition of human trafficking would be introduced, a standard definition of sexual exploitation, a statutory tort allowing survivors of trafficking to sue their traffickers, a statutory remedy allowing survivors to secure a protection order from their traffickers, and a warrant permitting a police officer to have entry to the premises. This Made in Alberta legislation will strengthen a survivor's ability to get away from their physical, emotional, and financial damage that they have suffered. It will empower them to help those who prey upon them and hold them accountable. This legislation allows us to deliver an important platform commitment and will make us a leader in Canada as we go and tackle this damaging issue to so many Albertans and Canadians. I expect members of both sides of this House will support this legislation, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Honourable members, the Solicitor General and Minister of Justice has moved second reading of the Bill 8. Is there anyone wishing to do so? Before we move on, I just might like to comment that the Honourable Member from Calgary-McCall is looking very angelic this morning. I'm not sure. Fortunately, there's no blinds there, but if you might like to choose another seat, you'd be welcome to do so as well. Is there anyone wishing to join in the debate? I see the Honourable Member for Calgary-Mountain View has risen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise this morning and speak to this bill. I think probably the first and most important thing to note about this bill is it's a considerable improvement over the state of affairs right now. So this bill definitely takes us in the right direction. It's an incredibly important bill. It's important, I think, to all Albertans. I think people are often confused about the state of play with respect to this. Human trafficking happens. It happens right here in Alberta. It's happening around us right now, even as we speak. And that's why it's important to act. I'd also like to commend the government on the fact that this bill is, and particularly the title of this bill is, in my view, considerably better than what was proposed in the original platform. And so I'm really glad to see that. The previous name, Saving the Girl Next Door, I think was offensive to many of the stakeholders and honestly a bit offensive to me as a woman. So I'm really glad to see that those changes have been made. I have had the opportunity to consult with some of the stakeholders in this area, and many of them indicated that the government had in fact spoken to them, and they were very pleased. They were pleased with the consultation, they were pleased to be asked, they were pleased to be asked to provide input, and they were pleased that their input resulted in the changing of the title of the bill. So I think that all of that is really, really good, and so I think the first thing we should do when we have the opportunity is to commend people on good work, and I think this has been overall a very good piece of work, and I would like to thank the government for the work they've done on it. There are, of course, a few concerns because that is my job in opposition. So I think probably one of the biggest concerns I have is, certainly in the announcement and the understanding of both the opposition, the stakeholders, and I think the public in general, is that in addition to this bill, there's also a committee that's coming with it. And the committee is going to act on a number of issues. In fact, in conversations we've had about this bill, where certain areas weren't talked on or weren't spoken to directly in the legislation, the answer has been that the committee will look at those things. And that's a good answer. I think the challenge is that the committee itself, to the best of my knowledge, has not met. Now, obviously, we're in a pandemic, so it's possible that that's had an impact, but we're not aware of what the plan is, and it's certainly not outlined explicitly in the legislation. So to me, that's a bit of a concern because I think the committee is a critical element of this, and I would like to see it explicitly referenced in the legislation just for the sake of certainty. I think the other thing that was raised very strongly from the individuals that I spoke to, and I would concur with this position, is that this is very good legislation, but the devil, as they say, is always in the details, and there needs to be support programs that come along with this. So simply saying someone has a right to seek this remedy is very different than giving them the necessary supports to be able to seek this remedy. People who are the victims of human trafficking are normally, even if they weren't previous to the experience, they're normally in a fairly vulnerable position. They're not usually in a position where they have a lot of money or power or the things that typically enable us to self-advocate effectively in society. And so we need to recognize that that disparity exists, that everyone is not in the same position, and that these individuals may have a more challenging time self-advocating for reasons of not necessarily having been cut off from financial support, having been cut off from family support, having been cut off from people that they know, often having been cut off for people that speak the language that they speak, and often finding themselves completely sort of culturally out of water. We grow up in this province and we are immersed in its culture. There are certain premises about the way that it operates, about the way that the law operates, that we take for granted, that are not the cases in other places. And so if someone has been trafficked in from another place and they don't have a lot of experience with Alberta or with Canada generally, they are at a disadvantage because of their inability to sort of understand the general legal framework which surrounds us, which we are all very familiar with. And so that means that a certain amount of support is often needed in order for them to even be able to take the steps that are given to them in legislation. Again, the fact that this government has moved forward with providing them those steps is very, very good. This is a very important thing to do. But often individuals will need assistance in operating that because, we look at human trafficking and we think of it as a horrible thing, and it is a horrible thing. It's an incredibly horrible thing. But that doesn't always mean that there's a clear, bright line distinction. I think, for instance, of the temporary foreign worker program from the federal government. There are a number of reasons that's very, very important. There are a lot of skills that may not be accessible in Canada, and we're able to bring in skilled people to do that work. They want to come in, everybody's happy. Unfortunately, in a lot of instances, when you're talking about a less skilled labor stream, the individual who is brought in is at an incredible disadvantage, and if the person bringing them in doesn't do the right thing out of the goodness of their heart, which most people will do, absolutely. I mean, most people follow the law, right? We don't write laws against murder because we think that most people will go and murder in the absence of a law. We write them for the few people who would violate the law. And so in most instances, that program works very well, but in a few instances, there can be abuse. Some of that abuse is human trafficking, and some of it won't quite meet the standard, which means that individuals are left in a position where they may not be sure whether this legislation applies to them or not. And so they will need supports, sort of emotionally, psychologically, potentially, but also legally. I think that's a really big piece. Also, potentially, when you're talking about people who have been brought into the country, because they may be here under a permit that specifies they can only work at a certain place, and that may be the abuser, they may find themselves unable to stay here in the absence of financial supports. And so I think that that's a big deal as well, because it will cause enormous amounts of concern. I think as well, it's important to recognize that people who have been the victims of sex trafficking are likely to be suffering from an enormous amount of trauma. And that makes it difficult, potentially, for them to face a case like this. So they may need legal supports, they may need emotional supports, they may need a number of supports to come forward. So all of that is to say that I think that the legislation itself is important. The supports that surround it, the financial, legal, and other supports are going to be incredibly important. And that is all work, pardon me, that is all work that this committee is meant to be doing. The challenge is, again, I don't think we're aware of what the membership of the committee is or when they're meeting or sort of what their timeline is or any of those details. So that's a bit of a concern. I think as well, some of the stakeholders I spoke to had not had a lot of time. Obviously, this bill was introduced yesterday. We've had a chance to review it, but it isn't everybody's job to review legislation professionally. So not everyone had had the chance to engage yet. So that makes it a little bit more difficult for us to take a position on this. I do want to comment on a couple of things that are in the bill. I think it's worth noting that the consideration that is given, so one of the things that's outlined here is things the judge ought to take into account when considering granting the order or not granting the order. And I think that all of these things are very, very important. It's a good list. I might add one or two things to it, but overall, I think it's quite well done. I'm particularly impressed by the inclusion of the respondent's control over the applicant, talking about sort of removing of personal effects. The holding of pets, I think, is actually one that actually is a much bigger deal than people realize. I'm really pleased to see that in there. And so overall, this is quite, I would say, a good list. One of the concerns I have, so one of the reasons that we're dealing with this right now, as people are probably aware right now, but may not be aware subsequently reading Hansard, is that we're in the middle of a pandemic. And so we are technically in violation, although I think we've been granted an exemption, of a rule about certain sizes of gatherings while we're here speaking today. Now, there are very important reasons for us to be here because there's some emergency work that needs to be done. And this legislation is incredibly important legislation. I think my concern is that with the current state of play, stakeholders are understandably focused on other things. It's sort of difficult to get a reaction, and we're trying to put this through very quickly. And I think it being important, in addition to meaning that it should happen, also means that it ought not to be rushed. And so I'm a little bit concerned about that rush. I'm a little bit concerned about that sort of attempt to ensure that it goes through perhaps in the absence of as much scrutiny as it would normally get, because again, because it is so very important. Now, I presume the fact that this is before us in an emergency sitting is because we think that it needs to come into force right away. So I'm a tiny bit concerned that that is not reflected in the in-force date. So we have Part 2 coming into force on December 31st, 2020, and the remainder not being explicitly stated, which means it comes into force on proclamation. So that basically means whenever Cabinet decrees. So my concern is that if we think it's incredibly urgent, I feel like we should have a date in the very near future listed on this bill. So that's certainly one of the things I'm concerned about. And if it isn't, and let me be clear about this. This is happening right now, so it's a good law to pass. It ought to be passed as quickly as possible. What I'm referring to specifically is the idea that we should put it through, in 2 or 3 days with limited ability to talk to stakeholders, limited ability to consult, limited ability for the public to weigh in and have an opinion on something this incredibly weighty, weighed against the need to get it in sort of in an immediate sense. And if that need to get it in is so high as to outweigh the fact that people are maybe not able to turn their minds to this in the way that they normally would, it seems to me like there ought to be a clear date on which it comes into force. And if that isn't the case, then we ought to maybe take a little bit more time to consider it, perhaps by way of a committee consideration, or, even if we knew sort of when, sorry, I keep calling it a committee, I believe it's actually a task force, but the task force sort of around human trafficking is meant to be convened, and who's going to sit on it. Because I think there are different perspectives on this issue. When I say that, I don't mean there are different perspectives as in people are for and against. I mean, there are different perspectives in terms of knowing that our aim is to ensure that we're preventing human trafficking, that we're providing remedy to individuals who have been victims of human trafficking. What is the best way to achieve that aim? And there will be sort of varied, I think, perspectives on that. And so I think those perspectives need to be heard, because this is a very complicated area, especially the interactions of the different laws. So the sort of primary forms of human trafficking tend to be around sexual exploitation or around labor trafficking. And each of those has incredible complexities within it. With respect to trafficking for purposes of sexual exploitation, there are interactions between this act and acts protecting children from sexual exploitation, right? So those are two different orders. They're not meant to interfere with each other, but the two acts do interact, because there are some circumstances in which both would apply and some circumstances in which only one or the other would apply. So it's a pretty complicated interaction. Add that to the fact that there is an interaction in terms of sexual exploitation with people who are engaged in sex work but may not, in fact, be exploited. And so both of those things need to be kept in mind in terms of how we balance what's going on here. When you talk about labor trafficking, it's incredibly complicated, especially for a provincial government to deal with, because a provincial government and the courts that we would be referring to don't necessarily have jurisdiction to deal with a work permit. So if it's the case that someone has come in on as a temporary foreign worker, they've been labor trafficked, they come forward, they make an application, it can be very, very complicated, because, so one of the things that could be happening, and it is listed in the Act, which I think is good, is that the individuals who are trafficking them, the quote-unquote employer, has taken their passport, and they therefore cannot return to the country from which they came, which is what they want to do. And so if that's what they want to do, then we ought to support that. But if they wish to stay in the country here, if they wish to avail themselves of the tort, which is also in this act, that action will take quite a long time to get to court. And so they need the ability, both legally and financially, to remain in the country in order for that to be a remedy for them at all. And so I think that is another incredibly important piece worth noting, because I think that leaves those individuals vulnerable, and it's quite a complexity, because the court who's pronouncing this order can't actually affect the permit directly. So either we have to work with the federal government to alter how that permit comes in, or another order that supersedes has to come in somehow. And then there's the whole piece around financial supports and eligibility for financial supports in these instances. And I do know there are some incredible people out there who specialize in doing exactly this sort of work, who specialize in going out there and applying for an extension of those sorts of permits, or applying for other abilities to stay in the country in instances when someone has been human trafficked. But it is very specialized work, and it is very complicated work. It is difficult work, and so that's why I think we need the time to hear from those individuals to make sure that when they look at this act, they say, yes, this is going to work for the purposes that we intend it to work. And again, I've heard from stakeholders that the work done by the minister and by the department in this case has been very, very good. There's been a lot of reaching out, there's been a lot of talking to folks, and so that, to me, that says probably it's really good. But I think as a legislator being asked to have an opinion, to provide a vote on this legislation, I'm required to double check that work. That's actually, I think, sort of my function in this place. So I think the ability to go out and to do that, to have that double checking, I think is incredibly important. And so I think with that, that's pretty much sums up what I have to say. Just, I guess, for clarity's sake, I think, again, that this is a good bill. It's a bill that moves us forward. It acts in an incredibly important area. I'm glad to see that it's happening. I think a lot of good consultation has been done on this bill. I think as a result of that good consultation, it's much better than the idea originally proposed in the platform during the election. And so congratulations to the government on that. But I would like a little more time to consult, and I would like to see a little bit more explicitly talk about who's going to be on the committee, when the committee is going to meet, when the committee is going to produce its report, if that's going to be public, all of those sorts of things which are not presently in this legislation. So with that, I will, and supports. We need to see supports in terms of legal aid, supports in terms of financial support, supports in terms of counseling, supports for individuals who are victims of human trafficking. And I think, yes, with that, I will say, in general, this looks like a fairly good bill, and thank you very much to the government.
Is there anyone else wishing to join in the debate this morning on second reading of Bill 8? See the Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the opportunity to just provide some opening comments on Bill 8, the Protecting Survivors of Human Trafficking Act. Again, I would join my honourable colleague from Calgary Mountain View to say how I think this is an important issue to be discussing here in the legislature. I think that we know that we, on normal circumstances, have a lot of people conducting different sorts of business here in the province, and we need to ensure that workers are protected in every possible circumstance. We know as well that there are illegal and nefarious activities that go on around human trafficking and the whole scope of what that can mean, which I will discuss here this morning. And it's important to protect people in the broadest possible way, regardless if they are citizens or landed immigrants or temporary foreign workers or just people that are here in the province. And so I certainly was pleased as well to see that from the first incarnation of this bill, that the scope of what this law would try to achieve has been widened considerably. I think, as the honourable member from Calgary Mountain View pointed out, just even the change in title is an indication that the government was choosing to use this bill to cover off a number of issues that I think needed to be addressed, not just and people of all places and all genders, not just the girl next door, as the original title had suggested. I think that at every juncture, it's important when we make or look for making laws here in the province that we ensure that we have support programs that can give substance to the protections that this bill, for example, is trying to afford. The protection implies both programming and teeth, right? So that you're not just sort of saying on paper that you want to protect people that have been victims of human trafficking, but in fact you have support programs in place to help those people and to find them and to provide assistance afterwards, and to, of course, chase down people that are breaking the law. So all of those things need to be included when you do endeavor in this sort of legislation. I would suggest that that's part of my concern with this bill, quite frankly, right? The fact that we do need to look at the whole scope of what it means to have human trafficking in any given jurisdiction, in this case, Alberta. And one example that I would like to look at, for example, here is the whole issue around temporary foreign workers, right? And we have, under normal circumstances, we have quite a lot of temporary foreign workers here in the province, and we in fact still do at this moment, right? Many of whom are now, of course, in a tight situation because, of course, they, travel is severely restricted, and some people might be in the midst or at the end of a contract and are stranded from their homes and their families. But anyway, my point is that if we need to make sure that supports for temporary foreign workers, right? Let's not forget that some employers they have a lot of sway over their situation, right? We know of cases that people being threatened or being somehow confined, or people employers withholding passports and so forth. That makes it very difficult for a temporary foreign worker to find protection. Of course, and then as was mentioned before, people are navigating in a different culture, a different set of laws and rules, and are just not as likely to come forward. As well, you need to make sure that you build legislation here to protect human trafficking so that people can stay to see justice done in any given file and case, right? Of course, if someone is here illegally or under a temporary foreign worker program, then, if we don't expeditiously find justice and supports and for that person, then they could end up having to leave the country. So I would suggest that part of looking for protection of survivors of human trafficking, that has to include working to ensure that with the federal government that you provide supports and laws so that people can stay and get help, assistance, and seek justice as well. So So yeah, I mean, again, I think that this bill speaks to something that is important in our society and something that wants addressing. For us to do it here and now, I find that to be a very sort of constrained time and place to talk about this subject. We all, I think, know that we're in the midst of a pandemic here and now, and it's very difficult to fully canvass this kind of legislation when people are in very extraordinary circumstances. And, you know, for us to be able to speak to people around that labor thing that I just described, for example, is very hard to do because people have other things on their mind, right, which is the immediate safety of themselves and their families with a very infectious pandemic all around us at this very moment, and difficult economic circumstances too. So people, you know, simply have those two issues top of mind and are being largely isolated too. I mean, I think that perhaps us being in this chamber here now, perhaps it makes us forget that the vast majority of Albertans are actually following the rules of the Chief Medical Officer and are isolating at this moment. And so this is a very big exception to that reality that's all around us here in the province of Alberta. And so when we try to do legislation like this, we need to, you know, how do we reach out to the various individuals and groups that we need to, when it's very difficult to do so, right? If not impossible, I would suggest. And so again, I said it yesterday and I'll say it again today. We need to apply a simple but emphatic rule with any legislation that is brought forward in a extraordinary sitting circumstance like that. Is it directly connected, and is it absolutely essential to help to deal with the pandemic that we are facing here in the province right now? It's just like when we, Mr. Speaker, bring forward emergency not emergency legislation, but emergency motions, right, in this chamber. And you have to decide, Mr. Speaker, if it is something that is of immediate concern, right? And you do a good job on that, and I thank you for that. And we should apply that same principle, I would suggest, Mr. Speaker, with one extra exceptional caveat, which is the legislation, the things that are being brought forward to this House, an immediate emergency that needs to be dealt with in regards to the pandemic? And if it's not, then number one, we are probably constrained from doing justice to that bill because, you know, whatever it happens to be, in this case, this very important topic that we are discussing here this morning, then we are constrained from probably giving the topic the attention and the time and the consideration that it's due, right? So it's in no way to suggest that protections of persons, survivors of human trafficking is anything less than absolutely essential for the general society in which we live. But is it essential to debate during an emergency that we're facing here, right now? That's the issue that I would suggest is a problem with this bill, and it's more of a time and place issue than it is with the actual substance of what this bill is trying to achieve. And so I want everyone here in this chamber and yourself, Mr. Speaker, to reflect on that, because you know, and I know, and all of us in our hearts, we know that what we are doing here and now is, it's good to talk about emergency things, and Albertans need to do so, but if it's not, we have to weigh that against the danger that us assembling here presents to not just everyone in this room, but all the support staff and potentially all of the many hundreds of other contacts that you will have outside in the general society this evening when you go home, this weekend when you go to your respective communities, and so forth. That's how a virus travels. It doesn't have legs. COVID-19 cannot move unless it is traveling from a human being to a human being, and the movements therein that you have as a human being. And so think about that hard. It's a very difficult thing, I know, and I know it's important for us to talk about emergency things, and perhaps we can find other ways in which to do that. For this bill, certainly I appreciate the work that has gone into it. There's lots of very important elements that I discussed, and I will continue to discuss here this morning and later on. But I just wanted to point out about using that application of a very simple concept, which is eminently true, and it's irrefutable, that if we are in this House discussing emergency things concerning the pandemic, that's one thing. If it doesn't meet the criteria of dealing with the immediate concerns around the pandemic, then I would suggest that this is not the time and place in which we should be discussing those things. Thank you.
Honourable Member, Standing Order 29-2A is available. If anyone has a brief question or a comment for the Honourable Member. Seeing none, is there anyone else wishing to join in the debate? I see the Honourable Member for Calgary West has risen.
Well, Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. And I've been intently listening to my friends over in the opposition. I feel as though they're trying to make the argument or case that this is in maybe something that's not, a piece of legislation that's not urgent. So I guess I feel it incumbent upon myself, Mr. Speaker, to probably provide a little bit of a counter argument to that. Obviously, again, using my experience, and I have sadly seen on many occasions the we'll call it the underbelly of society, where people, mostly young girls, have been trafficked, have been taken advantage of for various situations, for various reasons. And Mr. Speaker, COVID-19 is very, very serious, and I believe that the good people within the province of Alberta and the country of Canada are abiding by Chief Medical Officer's orders, and they're maintaining social distancing, and they're washing, and they're doing what they can. But in this particular case, Mr. Speaker, when we're talking about the people who traffic these young girls, these are not good people. They do not abide by the rules. In fact, I would probably argue through my experience that they really don't care that there is a COVID-19 crisis going on in the world right now. For them, it is business as usual. There are young girls, there are children, there are young women, there are people who are being trafficked right now. There are people that are suffering right now. So I do not believe for a second that this legislation is by no means not urgent. It is urgent. It is something that needs to be discussed. I feel, having listened to my friend from Mountain View, that through her research and discussion, and I know nothing is ever perfect, I understand that, nothing's ever absolute, but I feel as though that there is a consensus that this is a good bill that can do good to help people. And for that reason, Mr. Speaker, I think that this is something we just need to move along. It's, I sit here and I look at the bill, and I look at, let me just read point number one that I see, which is, it talks about an annual day for February 22nd to bring awareness to the issue of human trafficking. So let me talk about the importance of that. And you've heard me say this in this house before. We talk about education. I've talked about education, prevention, intervention. And of course, having a day to bring awareness is a part of education, to let people know that human trafficking does occur within the province of Alberta, that human trafficking does occur within Canada and, of course, other places around the world. And so it is so important to bring that awareness. The second point that I noticed in the bill is a standard definition of human trafficking, which will include parts of the criminal code definition. And I brought that up, Mr. Speaker, and one thing I noticed that was interesting here when I talked about definition is a trade of humans for the purposes of forced labor, sexual slavery, or commercial sexual exploitation for the trafficker or others. Human trafficking is the trade in people, especially women and children, and does not necessarily involve the movement of the person from one place to another. I think that's very important to understand that. Does not necessarily involve the movement of a person from one place to another. So, yes, there are people who have been trafficked from other countries into Canada or into the United States. But when I read this definition, the one that's associated to the criminal code, what gets me in regards to that is that this is something that is occurring here in Canada. So again, we can close all the borders, we can provide all these restrictions, we can self-isolate, we can, have our social distancing. But again, as I talked a little bit earlier, the bad guy doesn't care. The person who's trafficking these women, these children, they don't care. So they're going to continue to do this business as usual. The police are working right now, Mr. Speaker. So yes, there are people that are self-isolating. And then we have our first responders, we have our doctors, we have our nurses, we have our EMS, we have, of course, our police. They have to deal with these cases, even right now, Mr. Speaker. That's the truth. They're out there. They're doing what they can in regards to this pandemic, and they still have to. It's not about traffic stops and tickets. Sometimes it's about larger investigations that are still going on. We still have detectives that are doing work. We still have major crime units that are doing work. And some of that will involve human trafficking. So to provide extra tools for them, the tools in the toolbox that were so important. When we did the bill, that I worked cooperatively with the other government in regards to the pill press, right? And we talked about the issue regarding the fentanyl crisis. It was a tool in the toolbox, right? Serenity's Law was another tool in the toolbox. This is tools in the toolbox to help, right? And I think that, I see this as a very positive bill. I certainly, I'm not going to speak for, of course, the Justice Minister, but, if we can make it into Committee of the Whole, which I hope we can do, I think there was a couple of points that were brought up by the opposition. And the Justice Minister, I'm sure, will be happy. I don't want to speak for him, but I've got to know him as a person over the years. I'm sure he'd be happy to answer questions. And I think there's important. But I think it's important to move this stuff along, Mr. Speaker. There are children that are suffering right now as we speak. There are women who are being trafficked right now as we speak. And if this is a tool in the toolbox that can help them, then I think this is something that we need to continue to just really move along, quite frankly. I read a couple other things here, a statutory tort allowing survivors to sue their traffickers, which will require no proof of damages and would be required in a civil action, and will also eliminate the limitation period for regular actions to ensure survivors have the time to heal before starting a lawsuit, and will provide. That's huge. That's taking the power that bad person holds over that victim and putting that power back into their hands. That's a huge, and that's something that that's something that we need to move along. A statutory protection order to fill a gap that will better meet the needs of survivors of human trafficking. The order will be 3 years in duration, and penalties for violating the order will include up to 2 years in jail and up to $50,000 fine. Let me just explain to you, Mr. Speaker, and when I was in the Calgary Police Service, we had a section that was dealing with this sort of stuff. These are complex cases, in many cases not very easy to prove. Trying to prove a case where somebody is living off the avails of others, as an example, is something that is very, very complex and requires many, many resources and requires more than just the constable on the street who's just taking calls to service. There's usually a whole series of investigations and plans that are put forward to deal with these sort of cases. So again, but this sort of thing, a statutory protection order to fill in the gap, again, it's helping the victims, it's helping the police, it's helping to get that offender off the street, to put a responsibility, accountability on that bad person who's taken advantage of those women, those children, and those who are being victimized by their criminal behavior. And lastly, Mr. Speaker, a new warrant permitting a police officer entry to a location or residence and search for, assist, and remove of trafficking victims. Again, Mr. Speaker, tool in the toolbox, right? Yes, in the police, we have, through the course of investigation, if we do believe that a person is at risk, we have exigent circumstances that may allow us entry into a residence. We, of course, can set up a perimeter on a containment, we'll say, on a residence, and we can get what's known as a Feeney warrant if need be to gain entry. But this is, again, another tool in the toolbox to assist with gaining entry into that home where the police believe on reasonable and probable grounds that we might have somebody who may be the victim of human trafficking. Again, Mr. Speaker, this is something that is occurring right now. This is a situation that may be occurring within the province right now where somebody, I think we would all be naive to think that there's not somebody somewhere within this province right now who is not at this moment the victim of some form of human trafficking. So, you know what? I appreciate the comments that were made by my friends in the official opposition, and I think there's a lot for us to discuss, quite frankly, in committee of the whole. And I hope that we can move this legislation along out of second reading, and really, I think this would show leadership with Chamber under extraordinary circumstances to do something, to provide some tools for victims of human trafficking, tools in the toolbox for police officers. And I think that this is a good piece of legislation. This is a step in the right direction. And Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank you very much for your time this morning. I cede my time.
Honourable members, Standing Order 29-2A is available. I see the Honourable Member for Calgary Mountain View has risen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think since the Honourable Member has taken the time to sort of thrust a position, one which I think we don't necessarily hold upon us, I think it's incumbent on me to perhaps clarify, since it seems that perhaps, at least for some who were listening, my comments were unclear. We are supportive generally of this legislation. I have looked over the legislation. I have talked to stakeholders both in my previous role and in my current role about legislation of exactly this nature, which is one of the reasons I know it's incredibly complicated. And generally, my reading of it and my experience talking to people about how this goes forward would suggest that this legislation is quite good. That being said, I am not the expert in the area. I don't work in this area. I never have. worked on the front lines doing this work day in and day out. And so my analysis that I think it looks pretty good, I don't think that that's sufficient. I don't think that that's a sufficient statement for me to take back to my constituents or to the people of this entire province. And so I think it's fair for me to say, stakeholders were a bit surprised by the timing of the introduction. I don't know that everyone has had a chance to analyze the bill now that the text is available. And the text of the legislation is the important thing. That is the thing that we are here to discuss in this House. I'm fully aware that this is incredibly important. I'm fully aware that people are the victims of human trafficking right now, even as we speak. And that does make it important, and it absolutely makes it important to move it forward. It also makes it important to be certain that we're getting it right, to be certain that we've taken, when we're talking about legislation that has been quite a long time in coming, really, I think, taking 1 or 2 extra days to speak to people is not an unreasonable position to take. Again, I would say I think we're generally supportive. We do have questions, which I think is fair. I think that's the point of debate in this House. And having those questions doesn't mean that we don't think that the people engaged in human trafficking are, as the member said, very bad people. They are very bad people. They're terrible people. That's why we're supportive of this legislation, because we think that we ought to be punishing the people who engage in this behavior, and we ought to be protecting the victims of this behavior. But that being said, there are a lot of details missing. A lot has been left to the committee, whether or not support will be provided for legal counsel for the victims of human trafficking, whether or not support will be provided to ensure financial supports, what sort of counseling supports will be available, whether sort of more fulsome reintegration supports are available. All those sorts of things are, I think, very relevant questions, because they are the things that make the legislation work. And so I do want to make it incredibly clear. We don't think that this is something that's not important. We don't think that this is something that shouldn't be moved forward at the soonest possible opportunity. And we certainly don't think that the people engaged in this behavior are wait, that sentence was about to be a double negative. We certainly do think that the people that engaged in this behavior are very, very bad. Sorry, double negative is very unclear. I just want to reassure my honourable colleague that we do think that that's absolutely that absolutely is the case. I think the point was just that this is a time where it's more challenging to do that due diligence to ensure that on what is an incredibly, incredibly important issue, that everything is sort of appropriately moving forward, and we have all the supports we need, and that this committee will be moving forward. So that is all I wanted to say, was to sort of rise and clarify that, because I think. Again, I think that the honourable member from Calgary West is absolutely correct. This is a big issue. It is an issue that is happening all around us, and he's right. That awareness piece is an important piece, because there are a lot of people who maybe aren't aware, but this is in fact going on all around us. So thank you very much.
Honourable members, is there anyone else wishing to join in the debate for second reading, as the time for 29-2A had elapsed? The Honourable, the member for Calgary-McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise today and speak to Bill 8, Protecting Survivors of Human Trafficking Act. And bill relates to basic human rights. Bill relates to basic human dignity. And I think we are fully in support of the intent of this bill. We believe on this side of the House that's as important and as the fundamental role of the government in a society. Good to see you in the chair, sir. It's the fundamental role of the government in our society that they ensure that the basic fundamental human rights, they are preserved, protected, and upheld. And certainly it's a step in the right direction to support those who are victims of trafficking. I think it's akin to modern-day slavery, where people are exploited in many different ways. And it's certainly an important issue, and I'm glad to see that government is taking steps on it. And when we ask about the timing of this bill, it's in no way, shape, or manner that for a second we're talking about the importance of this topic. All we are saying, this is an important topic that deserves a full and robust debate in this legislature, that deserves participation from the victims and survivors of human trafficking, that deserves participation from the organizations, individuals who have been working in this area. And at this time, when we know that many things have been shut down, when we know that people are doing that physical distancing, social isolation, all those things, it's challenging for people to participate. And if government was to implement this piece of legislation upon its passing from this legislature, then sure, but what we are seeing in this legislation is the legislation will still come into effect by the end of the year. We will have an awareness day next year in February 22nd. So when we ask about the urgency of this legislation, it's not our intention, and in no way, shape, or manner we're questioning the importance of this important piece of legislation. Having said that, I will share some observations as well. And ever since that was put on the order paper, I have looked into this issue. Personally, I do have a background with rights movements, so this issue is of particular interest to me. And I do note that Canada was among one of the first few countries who signed on to the United Nations Declaration Against Transnational Organized Crime and the Trafficking in Person Protocol. Canada was among the first few countries who signed on to it. And since then, I think there have been certain developments. It's part of, it's in the criminal code, and it's a criminal activity under the Criminal Code of Canada. It's also referenced in Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, and that's unlawful under that act as well. And there was a national strategy to combat human trafficking that Canada brought forward in 2012. And that strategy was reviewed in 2016, evaluated, and there are a number of things that I may refer to later in my remarks that came out of that evaluation as well. But let me talk about when we say that we want to have a full opportunity to have a robust debate. I'm saying it because even in these circumstances, ever since it's been introduced, I've been reached out by 2-3 friends, 2-3 stakeholders, and first and foremost, I was talking to a friend of mine who practices Indigenous law. I used to practice Indigenous law before running for public office. and they have raised concerns with respect to missing and murdered women inquiry, that how this bill interacts with that inquiry, because for the most part there are many causes for that, but one of the causes is that those women are exploited in many different ways, and through that inquiry, sexual exploitation, labor exploitation, those were the kind of things that were highlighted at the root causes of that inquiry as well. So when we are talking about those survivors, when we are talking about protecting those victims, I think it is important that we take into consideration those recommendations coming out of missing and murdered women inquiry. And with that, I think I would like to know if anybody wants to share that what consultations government had with indigenous communities across this province, what consultation the government had with the families and loved ones of the victims of missing and murdered women, and what consultation government had with those survivors of that heinous crime. So that's important, that when we talk about protection of survivors of Human Trafficking Act, that we look at all aspects of this crime and we take into account all perspectives, including recommendations coming from missing and murdered women, and we speak to First Nation communities, those survivors, those victims, and organizations advocating on behalf of missing and murdered women. Second thing, that's mostly I'm hearing from my own communities around my constituency. A number of people have raised this issue before, and they have reached out to government as well. I'm aware that lately there has been concerns with respect to exploitation of students, foreign students, who are coming into different institutions here in Calgary, across this province, across this country, that they are coming on student visas, they have certain restrictions, and end of the day, then they are employed by some employers, and there are widespread reports that their labor is exploited. So again, if there was any conversation with those groups who are advocating for those students, I would urge government to share with us, so that can help us understand what this bill covers, that can help us assure us that, okay, these are the concerns that our constituents have raised. They will be addressed. Then with respect to temporary foreign workers, we know that we have a very vibrant community of Filipino Albertans, and many of them are also coming from Philippines, and they come from many different, temporary foreign workers come from many different countries, but they also come from Philippines as well. I'm referring to Philippines because the individual who reached out to me, they come from Philippines, and they were talking specifically in the context of workforce coming from Philippines. So what happens there, that they come under certain visa, under certain conditions, and if they change employer, they are not able to continue employment with some other employers. There are certain restrictions, and they end up in conditions where they may agree to substandard treatment, where they may submit to their labor exploitation and all those things. So all these three things that I indicated that I have heard directly from my constituents, my community, my friends, stakeholders, that they want further clarity on it, and personally I would like to have further clarity on it, that which of these communities were consulted and what was the feedback and what was included, what was not considered, all those things. Also, as I indicated earlier, that it's an important issue, and when we talk about it, I think Bill is focused on a few things that I will highlight. Bill is focused on quite a bit on the enforcement of these orders, of these provisions. I think with respect to enforcement, there are a couple of things that I would highlight. If I am speaking from my own perspective, from my own community's perspective, I think my colleague from Mountain View indicated that there can be number of challenges. There can be a number of barriers, like cultural barriers, language barriers, like basic understanding of the legal system and legal regime within Canada. So I think when it comes to enforcement, government need to back that with proper supports and proper resources, that those who are victims, those who are survivors, they not only have knowledge, information, but they do have needed resources to be able to benefit from the provisions of this act, to be able to benefit from the protection under this act. And that resources and public awareness part is also important, that we need to have resources to have public campaigns supported, like there is a day dedicated February 22nd, but I think we need to have continuous public awareness campaign that can highlight this issue, that can alert public to this issue, and make it possible that where people will see fellow Albertans, fellow humans in these circumstances, that they feel responsible to come forward and report those incidents. So it's important that when we talk about enforcement, that we back our actions, we back these provisions, we back these protections with proper resources and proper public awareness campaigns. I also note that federal government last year, they announced $57 million in their national strategy to combat human trafficking. And when they evaluated their strategy, some of the key findings were that this national plan should work in collaboration with provinces. And since it was just recent, I would like to know what collaboration province has with the federal government.
Honorable members, Standing Order 29-2A is available for a brief question or comment if anyone has one. Seeing none, anyone wishing to join in the debate? The Honorable Member for Edmonton Riverview.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise and speak regarding Bill 8, protecting survivors of human trafficking. And so from what we understand, certainly this bill is doing a few things. First of all, it's creating an annual day, February 22nd, to bring awareness to the issue of human trafficking. It's standardizing the definition of human trafficking. and also of sexual exploitation. It's creating a statutory tort allowing victims of trafficking to sue their traffickers, and a statutory remedy allowing victims to secure a protection order for their traffickers, and also a warrant permitting a police officer to have entry in situations of this. So as my colleagues have shared already, we are in the NDP caucus largely pleased with this legislation. The piece that is confusing for us, and we have spoken about this already, is that during a pandemic, a global pandemic, we are here in the legislature debating this legislation. And not that it's not an important piece of legislation, it is. But one of the things that the government did indicate to us is that they would not reconvene the Assembly during the pandemic, except for matters that dealt directly to this pandemic. And so, of course, this legislation doesn't do that. This legislation, of course, is needed, but it is something that has been needed for a very long time, and it is something that is ongoing. It's not emergent because of the pandemic. And so I guess I question why we're doing that now, because it's an extraordinary situation for us to be actually in the Assembly right now. Certainly colleagues across this country, federally, are not sitting. And they're not sitting because there is significant issues in their communities that they must support. And certainly as an MLA myself, I have great concern for my constituents, and I'd like to be able to be available to them more. But instead, I must come into this Assembly, and I have some concerns with that, especially when it seems like the government is lacking some integrity in what it has shared with us previously. Certainly, we had, our NDP caucus had said that we would come to the legislature absolutely if there was some emergent legislation that was needed that directly relates to the pandemic. But of course, this is not an example of such. But here we are. So I guess another point I'd like to make is that today, well, right now we have 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 of the NDP caucus are sitting in the Assembly at this moment. Should I count myself? No, I counted right, yeah. Oh, we're not supposed to talk about that.
Be cautious with
Excuse
referring
me.
to
Sure.
the absence of the presence of a member.
Right.
All members have busy schedules, and they may or may not be in the chamber
Right.
for any reason. And so we might just offer a bit of caution.
My apologies, Mr. Speaker. Of course, I forgot about that. Certainly, I know that many of my colleagues, and we're 24 strong, would like to be here today to actually speak about this legislation, and I'm sure that that's true on the other side of the aisle. The colleagues there would also like to, but because of the circumstances that we're in, we want to make sure that we're following the guidelines of the Chief Medical Officer of Health. We're making things a bit different in the Assembly, and that's important. I mean, this piece of legislation, however, is extremely important, and I know that as elected officials, we want to, of course, represent our constituents, but we also want to put in our own view and represent the view of our constituents in this Assembly, and that's become more difficult to do because of the current pandemic that we're in. And besides all of that, certainly we are breaking some of the orders of the Chief Medical Officer of Health, even though I know we have had an exception, but really gatherings of more than 15 are what the order indicates, but we have a much larger group here today than that. So it's unfortunate that this isn't garnering enough, the really robust debate it deserves, because we have a much larger issue, an issue really of life and death in our province. And I mean, not that I mean, this bill also deals with people who could be hurt, and sometimes so severely that they do lose their lives. But I mean, we know that this is, that we're all preoccupied, and preoccupied is not the right word. We're all very concerned about what's happening in our province, in our country, on our planet. And I know, like many of the members in the Assembly, besides the very important concerns of our constituents, we also have families that we're connected to. And if I can just stay a little bit more on constituents, this week was supposed to be constituency week. I don't know, I just want to remind everybody that we're supposed to be in our constituencies. And of course, one of the very important jobs of any MLA is to serve the constituents in their riding. And so I'd certainly like to be in my riding, being able to reach out to businesses, nonprofits, reach out to families, and do what I can to support them and see what concerns they have and what issues they may have with navigating public provincial programs, because certainly that's an important job I have. But I'm here today, and I can't do that. And I want to be a support to my constituents in that way. And I really feel that's what we should be doing at this time. And besides that, I mean, and I share that not only because of myself, but because of the 87 MLAs here in the Assembly. They all have these pulls too, and I'm sure it's difficult. But we all have families also, and I have parents who, my father's 90 and my mom's 83, and they live in seniors housing in Edmonton. And we're no longer able to, see them anymore. And, they are certainly in that vulnerable population. The vast majority of people who've passed away because of COVID-19 are 80 or above. And so my family is, my parents are in that category. And so it weighs on me heavily what is going on. And I don't share this for you to have some concern for me. I share that because I know that each of the members here has those kind of challenges too, and that they are concerned about their family systems. And at a time when this significant health issue is really rampaging through our province, that's what we should be focused on. And I'm deeply concerned that the government doesn't share my view. Just keeping on sort of the theme of our families and just the needs that they have, I'm certainly concerned also about, people have lost their incomes. And so the wherewithal to actually provide for their families, and these are, significant concerns for people. I mean, before I came to work today, my son, who gets up at 6:30 and works construction, came running up the stairs just before I left, and he said, "Mom," and I was getting ready, and I said, "Yes, what's going on?" And he came in and he said, "Mom, they laid me off just this morning." So, many people have been laid off in Alberta, but that's what I dealt with just before I came to work. And my son's 21, and he had been struggling to get jobs and working, but he had worked for a little bit doing framing. And so, before I came in here today, I'm trying to support him. He's kind of downhearted, upset, and I know that Albertans all across this province are dealing with that. And that's where we should be focusing. We should be focusing on supporting each other and not sitting in this legislature debating legislation that is not focused on COVID-19 and what needs to happen for this government, because we have a very significant issues emerging from that. So again, each one of us has families that need our support in those communities.
point of order has been called. The Honourable Member for Calgary West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I certainly rise under 23B, speaks to a matter other than the question under discussion. I appreciate the member and obviously the frustrations for which she's displaying at the moment here, but certainly there are other avenues for her to discuss her frustrations in regards to what is occurring at this very moment within this chamber. Right now, Mr. Speaker, what we have under discussion is Bill number 8 in the second reading, Protecting Survivors of Human Trafficking Act. I certainly thank her for her remarks. However, I do ask that I certainly would like to make the argument, of course, that she stay talking about that specific act. Thank you very much.
The Honourable, the Member for Calgary Mountain View.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think the member had certainly begun in terms of speaking about the bill, and I think she will absolutely return to speaking about the bill. Mr. Speaker, I think we've had a fairly wide latitude this morning and in general when speaking about this bill. But it is worth noting, especially since the Honourable Member from Calgary West himself spent some considerable time during his remarks talking about the urgency of this legislation and why the House needs to be recalled, because those are the circumstances in which we find ourselves. And I think that, we are having a dispute as to the facts. The Honourable Member who is speaking currently, I think, actually isn't even really disputing the facts. I think she concurs that this is important legislation. But I think that what she's saying is this is not the issue on which Albertans' minds are presently focused. Do you think we could maybe cut the side conversations? I think this is, legislation that is incredibly important. Albertans, who are the people affected by this legislation, who care, in my view, very deeply about this legislation, have the right to weigh in. And many of them, like the member who was speaking, find themselves in a position where they are focused on other things for reasons beyond our control. So I certainly think that she was speaking about the bill. She was speaking about the circumstances surrounding the bill in this House. I think she was speaking about the fact that many people out there in the world are maybe not focused on this particular bill at this time. And given that our position is that we would like some time to speak to the stakeholders, and that on something that is incredibly important, it is relevant to take some time to speak to the stakeholders that, like each and every one of us in this House, are likely experiencing these sorts of events in their life. So I think that does make it relevant, but I'm sure that the member will be happy to return to speaking generally about the legislation.
Honourable Members, I'm prepared to rule on this point of order unless there is any other conjecture. I'd like to remind all members of the House that page 628 of House of Commons Procedure and Practice, 3rd edition, reads, "A regard to the privileges and dignity of Parliament demands that its time should not be wasted idly in fruitless discussion, and consequently every member who addresses the House should endeavour to confine him or herself as closely as possible to the question under consideration." End quote. This advice still applies today as the business of government grows ever more complex and the time of the House is limited. It is often sufficient for the Speaker to remind a member of the House called to order of the proper subject matter of the debate and to indicate a manner to which the member's remarks were irrelevant. It goes on to say, in doing so, speakers tend to be mindful of the need for some leniency. At times, they've allowed references to other matters in debate if they were made in a passing manner and not to the principal theme of the speech. I'd remind all members of the need for relevancy. I also think that it's reasonable that, given we're 3 speeches into the debate on Bill 8, that perhaps some leniency is allotted as well. But if we can stick to the topic, the time of the House will be much more effectively utilized. And so at this point in time, I'd say there's no point of order, but I encourage the member to get to the meat of the matter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, I guess I just want to say once again that, the government did indicate very clearly to the NDP caucus that they would call the House back only to deal matters directly related to the pandemic. And unfortunately, despite what we're hearing, this is not related specifically to the pandemic. So I just reiterate those comments. And it is sort of a question of integrity. So I guess what we're hearing from stakeholders in the NDP caucus is that people in the community that serve vulnerable people that may be trafficked are surprised by this legislation. They didn't expect it. And so when I hear that, I think, how come they're surprised? Well, I think then perhaps the government hasn't even spoken to them about it, hasn't even solicited their input about it. And certainly as a social worker for 30 years, I have lots of colleagues in that profession who work in this area, and they're telling me that they haven't heard about that. And that concerns me, and it concerns me significantly, because that is how good legislation is made. Because if you want to make good policy, guess who you talk to? You talk to people who work on the front lines. You talk to people who serve these people every day, who understand the barriers, who understand the challenges. But what we're hearing from the community is, hey, this is news to us. So that's a bit disturbing, more than a bit disturbing. That is very troubling. So that is something that the government needs to do. And of course, during this time of the pandemic, it's very difficult to do a lot of consultation, get the feedback from the community, because we're all being asked to self-isolate. And of course, we're dealing with a lot of different issues. And I know many people who are working in human trafficking area, supporting people in that area, may also work in the area of domestic violence. And we know, unfortunately, the sad truth is that rates of domestic violence are increasing. This is kind of sort of some perfect circumstances for perpetrators, because perpetrators often want to isolate their victims, and here we're encouraging that in our community right now. And so people have less recourse to be connected with friends or family or have the supports they need because they are isolated in their own communities. So let me tell you that people working in this area are extremely busy at this time. There's so much need, and we want to make sure all Albertans are safe, that women or children are cared for. And so this is their focus right now. And yet this bill is being brought in without their input, and that's wrong. And we know, too, that there's many organizations that, we would look to provide input on this issue. And we're just wanting to know if the government has actually reached out to them. And again, what we're hearing in the community is they haven't. Stakeholders like the Edmonton Social Planning Council, have they been consulted with? Certainly, they know a lot about housing. There's a report just recently completed by John Kolkman that talks about just the affordable housing issue in our province, in our city. And this input would be extremely helpful for this legislation. Another agency is the John Howard Society. They also could give excellent input into this bill. And again, we're wondering if the government has consulted with them. ACT Alberta, and that stands, I'm not going to remember what it stands for, but it is an organization that works with people who have been human trafficked and certainly are significant experts in the area. So again, that's another organization that this government
Honourable members, Standing Order 29-2A is available. I see the Honourable Member for Calgary West has risen to
Thank you very much. I'd like
question
to
or comment.
thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for her comments. I do have a couple of things I would like to add. Human trafficking was in the UCP platform during the most recent election that we had, so it should be something that certainly if you follow politics, certainly something that people should be aware of. And maybe I wasn't clear, Mr. Speaker, when I was referring to bad guys or bad people, what I was referring to are criminals, people who do not abide by the law. Certainly likely do not abide by social distancing or even the rules of the chief medical officer. And I'd like to know if what I heard was not considered to be exigent, then I wonder, are there any comments or words for the young children, the young girls? This isn't exigent right now. This isn't something that is related to the COVID-19 virus. Therefore, it's something that can be put on hold. I can tell you their lives are at risk right now. And if this is something that we can get through this House, when I read this, a new warranty permitting a police officer entry to a location or residence to search for, assist, and remove trafficking victim, to search and remove a trafficking victim from a home. So am I hearing that member say that, oh, I'm sorry, police, you know what, you can stand on containment. I'm glad you know that that person is being held captive. I know that you know that that person is being used and abused. But you know what? It's not exigent because it's not related to the COVID-19 virus. So therefore, you know what? We're just going to put it on hold right now. Is that the message that we're telling these young girls? Is that the message that we're telling the police, that this is not as important? That's not a message. Look, I think I heard some consensus here. I thought I was hearing some agreement, right? This is something I think that we're on the same page. We need to move along, right? There are young girls. Look, I wear this pin not because it's a decorative piece. I wear it because it shows that I have done 10 years of night shifts, day shifts, dealing with hostage takings, dealing with some of the worst criminals imaginable on the streets of Calgary. I've dealt with situations where there's been knives, people have been stabbed, guns, officer-involved shootings. One of my guys got hit by a car. Right? These are the situations that I've dealt with. 10 years on the streets of Calgary, 2.5 downtown. In some of the most dangerous situations imaginable. I put my life on the line on a daily basis. There are children that I have had to go into houses and pull out. That is what we're talking about here, Mr. Speaker. That is the importance and exigency of this bill. And these criminals, these bad people, do not care about the COVID-19 virus. They do not care about social distancing. So this is important. This is something that is worthy of this House to be dealt with right now so that we can save the lives of these children and these young girls who are being used, abused, and sadly by the criminals of this province. Mr. Speaker, thank you.
Honourable members, there's 45 seconds left. I see the Honourable Member for Calgary Mountain View has risen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I don't know why I need to keep reiterating this, but I'll reiterate it again. We do think that criminals are bad. We do think that human trafficking is bad. I've said it several times. I'm not sure why the honourable member doesn't seem to be hearing it. But I think that saying that we need time to get this right because it's incredibly important should not be equated with saying it's not important. I think that saying more than 72 hours is warranted for this incredibly important legislation is very, very reasonable in the circumstances. Thank you.
Honorable members, unfortunately, the time has elapsed for Standing Order 29-2A. Is there anyone else wishing to join in the debate? I see the Honorable Member for Banff-Kananaskis has risen.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I am actually very happy to stand here today and speak in support of this legislation. I'm not going to speak super long on it because every day, frankly, every minute and every second that we don't get this bill through committee and to committee and through committee and out of committee and passed is a minute that we are putting these women, these children, these girls at risk. And it's a second that we are not taking action. And it's shocking to me that Alberta currently has no legislation at all that currently supports human trafficking in our province. And I think it is so incredibly important that we are debating this legislation today and that we get this through our chamber and support. And I am happy to hear that our NDP opposition in theory supports the premise of this legislation. It sounds like there may be some amendments or some further discussion to be had in committee, but I am grateful to hear that they are in support of the premise. But I must say, Mr. Speaker, at the same time, it frustrates me to absolutely no end. In fact, it frankly infuriates me that some members across the aisle are sitting there and saying that because we're in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic, this legislation is irrelevant right now. And they're saying, they actually explicitly said that they would rather be sitting at home than debating this legislation because it is so unimportant. And Mr. Speaker, that is despicable. That's disgraceful to the women and the girls who are going through this crisis right now. And I'd actually be curious to see or to hear what those women and girls who are victims of human trafficking would think if they heard the members across the aisle say, oh, this isn't important right now, I'd rather be sitting at home. I think that is so unbelievably out of touch and cruel. And I understand, Mr. Speaker, we are in the middle of this COVID-19 global pandemic, and don't get me wrong, it is very important, and I'm so thankful that our government has taken very swift and very serious action on both the health and the economic fronts of COVID-19 with some support from our opposition. But Mr. Speaker, just because COVID-19 is in the limelight right now, just because it's a crisis that is at the forefront and in the limelight of our society, does not mean the crises that occur in the shadows are any less important. And Mr. Speaker, right now, there is human trafficking going on. There are women and girls and individuals who are in the shadows suffering from this. And just because they're in the shadows does not mean they're any less important than the other pandemics and the other crises our society is facing. So I don't understand how we can pretend this isn't an urgent issue. There is urgency to this because every second that we don't act, more victims are suffering because our government is not acting. And Mr. Speaker, if we go through this legislation, I mean, I think it's absolutely fantastic, and I'm so grateful that our Minister of Justice has put this forward. I mean, it talks about creating an annual day, February 22nd, to bring public awareness to this issue and make sure that it doesn't stay in the shadows of our society. It creates a standard definition of human trafficking so that our law enforcement and our individuals or those who may know victims can call it when they see it, and they can identify it, and they can act. And it will, create a tort that allows survivors to sue their traffickers. They won't need to provide any proof of their damages, and it will give them time, a grace period, to heal before they take those actions and before they sue. And, 3 years jail time and duration of penalties that up to $50,000 for the perpetrators. Mr. Speaker, as the member for Calgary West said, this legislation takes the power that these perpetrators hold so strongly over their victims, and it puts that power back in the hands of the victims and allows these victims to take action and to take control of their own destinies. And if that's not something that a government should support and that a government needs to do as urgently as possible, then I don't know what is, Mr. Speaker. As a government and as elected officials, and frankly as a society, we owe it to these victims to take care of them, to help them, to give them power, and to give them a way out of their situations. And, the legislation, it's talking about creating a standard definition based directly on the criminal code definition at a federal level. And if we read that definition, it says it involves the recruitment, transportation, harboring, and or existing control, direction or influence over the movements of a person in order to exploit that person, typically through sexual or forced labor. So, Mr. Speaker, it's a no-brainer to me that there are so many people who suffer from this on a daily basis, and there have been for years because no legislation exists in our province. And it's time that this legislation gets put forward, and it's time that this legislation gets passed. And I don't understand how we can pretend that because human trafficking and human traffickers lurk in the quiet and in the night and in the depths of society, just because that crisis isn't, in the forefront of people's minds, that it should be any less important and any less urgent than dealing with the major crisis, which is in the media, which is COVID-19. Mr. Speaker, a crisis is a crisis, and we owe it to the most vulnerable members of our society to take action and to protect these people who have been victims of this for years. And, there are people, absolutely, there's no denying that there are people suffering through this COVID-19 pandemic, whether that be through health issues with themselves or their loved ones or their friends, or whether that be through economic means. They've lost their job, their business is going under. But, Mr. Speaker, those who are experiencing human trafficking, for those who have been or are still current victims, or even those maybe who are in threat of being victims of future human trafficking, for them, that crisis is just as real as the COVID-19 crisis is to other Albertans and other people around our globe. And so, Mr. Speaker, I hope that this Assembly can join together and support this legislation and say, this is a crisis and this is awful, and we'll call it as we see it. And we need to take action and protect these women and girls just as much as we are taking action to protect those who have fallen ill from COVID-19. So, Mr. Speaker, I'll conclude there because I think it's urgent we get this legislation passed, debated, maybe amended as quickly as possible if it needs to be. But I will wrap up my thoughts and just say that I really hope that we will gain support from both sides of the House for this legislation, and that, frankly, we'll have support from all Albertans who are watching or listening or reading this in the news today to say human trafficking is a problem and we care about the most vulnerable in our society.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Mountain View, under Standing Order 29-2A.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Where to begin with that? So I think I've reiterated on a number of occasions, for anyone watching at home, they're probably tired of hearing me say it over and over again, that we do think this is an incredibly important issue. And again, that's why we think it's incredibly important that stakeholders on the front line, people who are working in this area, have time to weigh in. And we think that as the official opposition, it is our job and our responsibility to do our due diligence and ensure that those voices were represented in the legislation. Now, I do understand that the minister and that ministerial staff at Justice and Solicitor General have done an incredible job of consultation. I understand that a lot of conversations occurred 6 months ago, but it is incredibly rich for the member for Banff Kananaskis to rise on her feet and say that our asking for a few more hours to have a conversation is absurd and that we love human traffickers, when really the enforced date for this bill is December. So essentially what she's saying is this is an emergency. We have to deal with it immediately, except that her own government has put an enforced date on this legislation of December 2020. So I think it's a little rich for her to rise and take that position in light of the legislation which is presently before us. And Mr. Speaker, again, I'm not sure why I'm having to reiterate this. We are generally supportive of this legislation. It does look generally good. But I think that when the member for Banff Kananaskis rises in her place and says, this is incredibly important, we need to be here talking about it, and suggests that members who have indicated that the modeling we present and our behavior during this pandemic is not equally important, is just incorrect. Human trafficking is incredibly detrimental. Victims are incredibly traumatized. This is absolutely urgent and important, and it's absolutely something we should be dealing with. But to hear the member from Banff Kananaskis suggest that somehow people out there who have very genuine and real fear about COVID-19 for very genuine and real reasons, such as the fact that people are dying, and the death toll is predicted to be fairly high. And for each one of us, it's not just ourselves, it's our loved ones. And so that too is an important issue. So when we rise and when we suggest that maybe not everyone is able to fully engage in this matter at this exact moment because they are engaged with worrying about their family members and the health of their family members, I don't think that that is an unreasonable suggestion by any means. And to hear that the member for Banff-Kananaskis is enraged that we would have that concern for our fellow Albertans, Mr. Speaker, I'm not even really sure what exactly can be said about that. Because, again, we are present in this room. We are clearly saying this is an incredibly important issue. This is an issue that absolutely needs to be dealt with, but it is an issue that needs to be dealt with correctly. To merely do something and say you're doing something about an issue is not enough. You need to do something that is actually helpful to the victims. And so to say, you know, less than 24 hours after this bill became public, less than 24 hours after stakeholders had the opportunity to read the text of the bill, to say it's unreasonable for those individuals to not have developed a fulsome position yet, I think that's a bit unfair. Now, again, I suspect this legislation is very good. I understand that the government did a lot of consultation. And I think it is in an incredibly important area. I think that the movement we have seen in the year since this government came in, from the original Saving the Girl Next Door proposal to this, which recognizes that nearly 50% of human trafficking victims are not victims of sex trafficking, but victims of labor trafficking, that recognizes the facts on the ground, is incredibly important. We are supportive, but I think people deserve a chance to weigh in.
Honourable members, is there anyone else wishing to join in the debate? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Meadows.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise and to have the opportunity to speak to the Bill 8, Protecting Survivors of Human Trafficking Act. I would say this is such an honor to be able to have the opportunity to participate in the debate or, discuss your view on such an incredibly important issue. It's so saddened to, I would say, in 21st century, saddened to face or having to be facing the issues or discussing the issues of that is real reality in this 21st century. I would say why I would say this is incredibly important. So in this developed society, in today's society, in the society in the 21st century, there are still people who are vulnerable, and there are still people, sick minds, they find this is the opportunity. They can take the advantage of the people they are suffering. So when we were talking about this issue is very broad, first of all, I really wanted to thank you, the Minister, for proposing this bill and putting the efforts to prepare this bill to bring into the House. Similarly, I'm also, when I'm hearing my caucus colleague, they're talking about the timing and talking about the importance of these stakeholders having been able to provide their inputs to make this bill more strong. It is incredibly important because discussing human trafficking itself, I feel it couldn't be a worse that I could name it like social stigma on our society. So there are still situations, there are still conditions, living conditions, where people are living and they can be taken the advantage of. So if we wanted to discuss the measures to prevent it, I feel personally this is very important also to discuss the root causes of this. I understand that as being the provincial jurisdiction in one of the widespread country, we will have the limitations, but I think it is very important to discuss the very broad factors of this issue. So without taking such things into consideration, we might give a potential to some of the important aspects of the bills could be compromised. So there are still the situation, the conditions in the world, the people, living in this society, probably living in Canada, people who didn't get the chance probably to visit and get around the world probably do not think of those things. There are still places around the world where people do not understand. People can't even think about the word. We always mostly use social security. There's a large number of population and a large number of area across the world. If you go out and you speak something about social security and they don't know what it is, and they will look at your face. So expecting to having the healthcare services. Another thing is that the people think that such thing that never exists anywhere in the world. Why we should even think about it, what you're talking about? Getting education. And there are still people who get education, or they manage to get education, they afford to do so somehow. And then there are situations, why these situations? This is a huge issue that then there's no jobs. So the situation, the vulnerable peoples, why they even become victims of human trafficking. As I wasn't really aware of which bill we were going to discuss today. When I just came in the house, I found out we will be discussing this Bill 8. First of all, I was happy to see that this House collectively and specifically to the government House members, they are considering this such an issue to discuss and to address this accordingly. So I was happy to see that. And same time, I was feeling a little bit sad that it personally did not give me enough chance. Probably I could, contribute more to this issue to bring some of the aspects into the light that would help this bill become better or stronger to help the bill actually make their mandate strong. So when we are discussing this, you need to understand why we always in the House, the primary responsibilities when it comes to the primary responsibilities to the members of this legislature, why we are always worrying about, and why the importance of the affordable child care, affordable education, the universal health care, accessible to everyone. So without having those fundamental facilities, services to the society, the community, that will give the rise to the situation where people will be left behind, the people will become more vulnerable, where the sick minds, as sitting in a society that's sad to, accept that there's still people, they think they can take advantage of those conditions and then get through. So, as my colleagues reiterated many times, saying it again, having supporting this bill in the House, I also feel that given this bit of more time, even people like me, I think I could have contributed more. There are such people in the communities. They can bring first-hand experience, and the stakeholders, they have very professional experience. They can bring it in, they can help probably shape this bill better what we are trying to do. So I was thinking this is a reasonable argument or input, I will say, instead. I never try to, in my personal life, never try to use my personal experience as to make the issues of debate ever. But I just lost my father 3 months ago, and having a busy family of 3 vulnerable people. I have a special need child, and I have 2 parents, my mother-in-law and my mother. They're not able to go to access the service they regularly would use. They cannot go to the doctors. So the worries, but the members were trying to probably point it to. I'm also worrying. I also wanted to do the job, but I have given to do it by my constituents. I wanted to represent. I don't want to miss the opportunity to be able to do my part when we are discussing very important issues. But at the same time, we understand the nature of the pandemic we are going through. We understand the nature of the virus we are talking about, how fast it travels, how it travels, specifically when over millions of people around the world have been affected, and thousands of people have lost their lives to it. I don't think this was unreasonable to bring into the discussion. We are not trying to block the bill. When I get a call from my constituents or the people who speak other languages and they feel comfortable to calling me from different ridings even, they're asking me what you're doing in the legislature. Their first question is this government is considering something to go forward to move to lockdown? Because people are worrying. People are staying home, and people are focused on what is happening around the world due to the COVID-19. So people are keeping with updates, and the figures, the numbers, the news is coming around. They are scary. Every single moment of the way, when we are looking, when we are watching, and people are very, very concerned. People are getting angry. People are getting anxious. So I think when the members are speaking and sharing some of those experiences, they're trying to give the feedback of the people of our riding, our constituents, and also the people of this province. As I said, the number of peoples, they have limitation to sometimes language, or they feel comfortable and confident calling to my office. And these are the kind of concerns we are sharing. And by having more time, I would say, it's not denying the situation that how important this issue is. It's not just, it doesn't mean we are opposing the issue. It's just giving us the opportunity to work with all those people. They can enrich this. They can enrich this, the efforts of the people, very people. They spent lots of time to put this bill together. So we could just take a benefit of this. That's all I wanted to add it to, Madam Speaker. So I think it will be wise to think about, like, I have more to say. I will wait for probably my turn in the other time. I have issues related to the temporary foreign workers, first-hand information that I'm curious about how this bill is going to address all those issues, but I will probably keep that for next time. And those are some of my remarks for the time being. That's all I wanted to say for this right now. And same time, I would like to adjourn the debate, Madam Speaker, on this. Thank you.
Did you, having heard the motion by the honourable member to adjourn debate, all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. So carried.
Under Government Bills and Orders for second reading, Bill 13, Emergency Management Amendment Act 2020, number 2, Honourable Mr. Madhu.
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I am honoured to rise and move second reading on Bill 13, which provides additional amendments to the Emergency Management Amendment Act 2020. In response to the changes we introduced to the Emergency Management Act on March 20th, we have worked with the cities of Edmonton, Calgary to develop further changes that would assist with the pandemic response. These changes complement other efforts from municipal affairs to help municipalities during this challenging time, including making previous amendments to the Emergency Management Act to allow local and provincial states of emergency to coexist, elevating the Provincial Operations Center to a Level 2, Level 3, and Level 4 to assist Alberta Health with information, communications, and cross-government coordination. Changing the regulations in the Municipal Government Act to give local governments the flexibility they need to meet remotely at this very difficult time. Extending reporting timelines under the Municipal Government Act for time-consuming legal obligations like intermunicipal collaboration frameworks and municipal tax assessment notices, and deferring education property taxes for businesses for 6 months, removed a scheduled population and inflation adjustment, and freezing the requisition rate to last year's level. The changes we are proposing today, Madam Speaker, include providing a longer duration for local states of emergency during a pandemic, and clarifying that it is an offense to not comply with orders made under states of local emergency or a provincial state of emergency. In developing these changes, Madam Speaker, it became obvious that additional changes are required to clarify the powers of a minister with respect to local states of emergency. On this point, we have developed 4 amendments. First, align states of local emergency in a pandemic with provincial states of emergency from a duration of 7 days to 90 days. This change recognizes the unique emergency situation demanded in a pandemic response. Second, clarify that electronic council meetings can be used to pass resolutions for local state of emergency. This change offers flexibility to councils and aligns with the current provincial government restrictions on public gatherings. Third, provide the Minister of Municipal Affairs with the authority to modify a local state of emergency without terminating it. This change will ensure that local states of emergency align with provincial direction without terminating them. And fourth, clarify that it is an offense to defy an order during a state of emergency. Currently, Madam Speaker, the Act only allows the enforceability of evacuation orders. This clarification will ensure that all orders in an emergency are enforceable. If passed, Madam Speaker, this bill will provide greater clarity and improved coordination between local and provincial responses to COVID-19 pandemic and future province-wide emergencies. With that, Madam Speaker, I move second reading.
Any other members wishing to speak to the bill? Seeing none, the Honourable Member for Calgary-McCall.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I rise to speak to Emergency Amendment Act. Yes, we all recognize that these are challenging times. Province is going through extremely difficult times. All Albertans are facing these challenges in many different ways. And we also have lost a number of Albertans to this pandemic as well. So let me begin by offering my condolences to all those who have lost their families, someone from their family, their loved one, to this pandemic. And when we talk about response to this pandemic, I think we must acknowledge that there are Albertans who are on the front lines of this pandemic, dealing with this emergency of an unprecedented nature, including, first and foremost, our healthcare workers who are doing everything they can to keep Albertans safe. And in these challenging times, in these difficult times, we as caucus are absolutely committed to working with the government on things that are needed and necessary for the government to manage this pandemic. And when that's the case, I think Albertan elected us to be their voice, to be their representatives. We are very pleased to be here, but at the same time, I think we do recognize when we are here, our job is to hold this government to account and make sure that the bills they are bringing forward, the powers they are granting themselves, don't go too far. It's our job to hold the government accountable and make sure that they don't overreach. And with Bill 10, I think I would suggest that government went quite far. In fact, government gave themselves power to not just suspend any law at their will, not only to modify any law at their will, but also the power to write and bring in force any new law without legislature's oversight at minister's subjective will to deal with the pandemic. So there are certainly concerns that whether the changes contained in this bill could have been made through the power that government gave itself under the Bill 10. But here we are. And our comment on three changes that government is suggesting through this piece of legislation it clarifies the language that non-compliant is an offense with any orders that are made under provincial or local emergencies, and which is a good thing. But I would suggest that as opposition, as I said, our role is to hold this government to account. And we will also take time that is needed and necessary to debate the bills, and we will not let government use this pandemic as a shield to pass things that are not of emergent nature, that can wait. We will make sure that government is not using pandemic as a shield to bypass meaningful consultations. That shouldn't happen. It shouldn't be used to bypass stakeholders in engagement with them. And only powers that should be sought in this legislature, they need to be reasonable in the circumstances, given the context, given the pandemic. Government shouldn't use pandemic as a shield for overreach. And we also must ensure that our democratic traditions, our democratic institutions, they are protected. And Albertans need to have a confidence that their government is operating with full, honest, and unconditional integrity when it comes to additional emergency powers that they are requesting from the legislature. As I said, we are happy to be here whenever it's needed and necessary to deal with this pandemic. And any suggestions that we don't want to be here, and any suggestions that when we ask for more time and debate, that we are somehow in the way of government managing this pandemic, that's not correct. But we need to be mindful that we as individuals, we as MLAs, are part of this society. We do get impacted by things that are happening around us. When we reach out, talk to individuals in our constituencies, most of them, they're in isolation. Some of them are being laid off. Some of them are struggling to keep up with their work routines. Some of them have their parents, loved one, in senior care center where they don't have any access to them. They can't visit them. Some of them have their kids laid off. So those things do impact all Albertans as individuals. Those things do impact us as Albertans as well. So when we come here, I think government need to make sure that we are dealing with things that are absolutely necessary and can't wait. And you cannot bring us here, lecture us about urgency of things, and then put coming into force date for those pieces of legislation 1 year out. If something is urgent, and my colleagues in the House from other side do believe that these things are urgent, they should ask their government. If things are urgent, then enforce them right away. That will demonstrate that government is working with honesty and integrity. And when they say things are urgent, those things are urgent. But if you will lecture us about urgency of things and coming into force that is 1 year out, I think then those things can also wait a little bit if we are not serious about enforcing them right away during this pandemic. And changes that are included in this one, I'm of the view, and there are many who will concur with me, that these are the changes government could have managed with the powers that they gave themselves under Bill 10. Because under Bill 10, they reserve for themselves unfettered authority to amend, suspend, or even write new laws. And it's the view of many of their friends as well. To name few, John Carpe, Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, and all those folks are also saying, many legal scholars are saying, that's what government did with the Bill 10. And now here is another amendment which extend the emergency from 7 days, changes it, to 90 days. That's a huge change. That's a huge change, and it will certainly have an impact on people's rights, because in an emergency, many civil liberties can be curtailed. And I remember sitting in this very house during Fort Mac fire, where there was local state of emergency, and every single day, we will hear from then opposition, when will that be lifted? Why it's too long? And when people will be allowed to go back to home? Like every single day, that was the question. And I'm not saying that that was not a good question. That was a legitimate question, because emergency should never extend beyond what was needed. And here, government is arbitrarily changing it from 7 days to 90 days. As I said, if emergency is needed, if these powers are needed, there should be measures in place to keep people safe, to keep Albertans safe, to allow their governments, to allow their institutions be able to manage the emergency. But just picking up a random date, random number of days, 90 days, changing it from 7 to 90, I think that's overreach. It raises concerns for many across our communities. It raises concerns about their civil liberties. And as I said, if those emergencies need to be in place, government can extend those 7 days emergencies. Government can rely on their Bill 10 powers to change those. But to arbitrarily put it, make it 90 days, I think that's government overreach. If they have some kind of analysis, if they have some kind of data, if they have some kind of stakeholder consultation, if they have some kind of ask coming from municipalities. For instance, I'm from Calgary. I will ask if it's coming from mayor's office, if it's coming from council's office. I would be happy to hear about that. That was the rationale for changing it from 7 to 90 days, and why 90 days was the magic number there. So I would love to hear that. Other thing, in Section 8, again, what government is doing, that despite Section 1B and C, the minister may, by order, restrict, prohibit, or terminate the exercise by a local authority of any powers by a person authorized by a local authority to exercise any power. And in the opening remarks, Minister mentioned that this will give government power to concurrently change the conditions in local emergency. But I don't think that it's stopping at just changing, making changes in local emergencies. It clearly says that minister, by order, he may restrict, prohibit, or terminate the exercise of any power by the local authority. It may terminate exercise of power by anybody authorized by local bylaws or local emergency powers. That's quite broad power for the minister to have and be able to terminate local emergencies, and I don't see any mention that minister may do so in consultation with local authorities. So there are a number of questions, there are a number of things that would help us understand government perspective, why these powers are necessary. I think in that regard, it would be helpful to know that who did minister consult prior to making these amendments. What did those people from local authorities, representative from local authorities, say about it? Was the mayor from Calgary, Edmonton, Red Deer, Grand Prairie, rural municipality of Wood Buffalo, what are they saying about it? Did minister consult with council member? Did he choose only pro-business council members or other council members as well? These are the details we need to know, because last time when he was engaged in Calgary on consultation, he made up and chose only pro-business council members. We didn't know what the matrix was for pro-business and not pro-business, but that's what was publicly reported. So that's why we are concerned who was consulted in Calgary, because Calgary came up with local emergency before the province did, and Calgary has taken a number of steps to manage the local emergency. At the same time, we do know that most of these cases, almost half of these cases of COVID-19, presumptive or confirmed cases, are coming out of Calgary. And personally, the area I represent, upper northeast, that's how it's mapped in that geospatial analysis of COVID-19 cases. It has second highest concentration of COVID-19 cases. So these are important questions, that how this power interacts with my city's ability, my local government's ability to manage those crises. And in the middle of those crises, the minister is now trying to retain a power which was not there before. So minister and government need to provide us with a rationale that what prompted them to seek that authorization. And local emergency management leadership, they are on the front lines of this pandemic. They are leading the way. They are trained in it. They are experienced in it. Some of them have dealt with local emergencies before. Some of them were there for 2013 flood in Calgary. They have dealt with these emergencies. They have expertise.
Are there any other members wishing to speak? Standing Order 29-2A is not yet available. The Honourable Member for Calgary-Buffalo.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'll pick up where my Honourable Member from Calgary-McCall left off and say with regard to Bill 13, the Emergency Amendment Act, it's unfortunate we didn't fully cover things off in Bill 10. Perhaps there's reasons for that. I know it's a different act, emergency amendment and public health, but here we are almost, well, a week later, dealing with issues related to emergencies again. And I was listening to the minister talk to the introduction of Bill 2, second reading on Bill 13. And I was very interested in some of the things he said with regard to the powers of the minister. And I scribbled them down, and I hope I've got them all correct. And perhaps if I don't, the minister at the Committee of the Whole can address the questions that I've got that follow up from my colleague from Calgary-McCall. I heard him talk about 4 powers, aligning the province with the local governments in terms of 7 to 90 days. So I take from that the provincial powers already go to 90 days, and this is an extension of the local government states of emergencies to 90 days. Got questions about that, perhaps why 90, why not 45, why not 30, but perhaps it was a specific request that I'm not aware of. Perhaps a local government thought that 90 days would be a better frame of time, especially when you're looking at a viral state of emergency or a virus as a state of emergency, as opposed to a shorter duration like a flood or other state of emergency that I just, off the top of my head, I can't think about. The second point that the minister talked about was electronic council meetings to pass rules so that councils could meet electronically around the province. I know we've already dealt with that earlier in this pandemic, and I'm just not sure why it's here again. So perhaps the minister can address that. The third one is the authority. The minister has the authority to modify without council's agreement. Certainly he would probably, I suspect, try and get council's agreement, but this does give him the hammer if he chooses. And I would really welcome specific examples of where that kind of overreach into a local government's decision-making has been necessary in the past and would require this sort of amendment here before us again. I think that's under Section 8.1.02. So municipal councils, of course, make many decisions during emergencies, and they're closest. I would argue we were closest to the ground in terms of understanding what those emergencies were all about. And a minister, not necessarily this minister, any minister in their office, probably in the POC for some of that time, is not on the ground, though they're getting information. The best people with the most knowledge are the local officials, and this reach into being able to modify without the support of council decisions during an emergency seems an overreach to me. And the last is, of course, the issue around when people defy an order, ensuring that there's proper offense provisions, and the minister talked about those as well. Under the larger frame of improving coordination is what I heard the minister say. Seems like some of these are taking the opportunity for coordination away from local councils. So I'm not sure how that improves coordination. Like my colleague, I have also spoken with stakeholders in regards to this series of amendments, and we'll be offering our own amendments to this package in Committee of the Whole when that comes forward. The job of the opposition is always to hold the government to account, and that's what we'll endeavor to do with this Emergency Amendment Act 2020 number 2. We have a number of questions, and hopefully the minister will be able to address them. I saw a news report online yesterday and in the paper today that spoke specifically to who was consulted. The House Leader talked about 3 local governments that were consulted: Edmonton, Calgary, and Red Deer, and the association was also in the article talking about this. But we don't know what the mayors and councils from the cities of Lethbridge and Grand Prairie and the regional municipality of Wood Buffalo think about all of this. Not sure there's been adequate review. Certainly haven't heard about that from the minister or the House Leader yesterday. We don't know what the heads of SEMA and the Edmonton Emergency Management Agency think about all of this, and if they're comfortable with being told by this provision in number 8.1.02 that they should, the minister may by order rescind, cancel, or modify any bylaw enacted, resolution passed, action taken, order made, or direction given by a local authority during a state of a local emergency. And that those directions are given, Madam Speaker, with the guidance and direction of local emergency management authorities who are on the ground, as I say. So those are some of my initial thoughts with regard to all of this. Not hearing reasons yet in terms of the introduction of the bill from the minister with regard to the movement from 1 week to 90 days. Certainly, that's 90 days is a long time to be suspending the kind of typical way that local governments connect with their citizenry, and it may be inappropriate. It may be too far. Perhaps a 30-day time period would be a better time frame for local states of emergency and states of emergency generally. So what would others think about 90 days? Is there any other guidance that's been received by the minister for that time period, besides potentially a city saying 90 days would be better than a week? Is there any other stakeholders that have been consulted, perhaps in the civil society or the judiciary? Those are things that we would like to have more information about. We course, know that an influenza, or a COVID-19 pandemic is something that's novel and new, and we're all dealing with, and certainly agree with some ideas to remove. Just looking for this section, won't find it probably, but to update this act is not a bad thing, but to update it in conjunction with the real needs of local governments is where we should be going. And as a former city councillor, I think I can speak for local city councillors and councillors in general and say that, having power stripped from us in the event of a local emergency in conjunction with the support we were getting from the province would be very difficult to deal with because local councillors are empowered by their elected status to work on behalf of the jurisdiction they're elected in, and to essentially have that potentially taken away by Edmonton seems to fly in the face of coordination. It seems to be put in a lower order of government, and I can tell you that many local councillors do not agree that they are a lower order of government. They are an order of government in this country and should not be thought of as a farm team or a junior group of people who are there at the behest of a higher order of government. Madam Speaker, that is a common feeling of people elected at the municipal level all across this country. They don't feel like they're respected enough for their decision-making capability and disagree vehemently with being seen as a junior too. We've listened to municipal leaders also. That last comment was in listening to municipal leaders. And we have some amendments to this bill that we would like to bring forward at the Committee of the Whole. We know this is a challenging situation for all of us, but I personally believe that some of what's in this bill today as amendments is an overreach with regard to the powers to the minister. And then I'm not just talking about this minister, I'm talking about any minister in that municipal affairs seat. We, of course, need to operate closely with those on the ground and work with them and respect their decisions. And I don't think that is what I totally see here. And as a result, we'll be talking about some amendments at Committee Whole. But perhaps the minister can take the opportunity when he can get on his feet to address some of the questions that my colleague from Calgary-McCall and I have posed with regard to the breadth of consultations that occurred with this set of amendments coming forward. We see in the paper that AUMA was kind of weighed in on this, but nothing from the other association that deals with counties and municipal districts. What did they think about the reach and the amendments brought forward? What did other cities, there's 7 in total, I saw 3 mentioned. I heard 2 from the minister today. What did the other 5 think about all of this? And I don't know if they've all declared states of emergency, local states of emergency, but they all will have feelings about and opinions about that 8th section in here that would be taking away their powers in a local state of emergency, and the minister would be assuming responsibility for those actions at the local level. So are they fully in support of that part of this bill, or are they in support of other aspects of this bill? Perhaps the 90 days was mentioned by one municipality, but was it generally was a consensus that this should move towards 90 days, or is there a consensus around a fewer number of weeks and days for modifying the length of states of emergency? Those are some of the questions that I'd like to hear responded to from the minister. Those are some of the concerns that were brought up to me. Recognizing that this is the second time in 2 weeks that we're dealing with emergency powers, the really wondering if the minister has the power. Thank you.
Standing Order 29-2A is available. I see the Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs rising.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I would quickly respond to some of the comments and questions raised by the members opposite from Calgary-McCall and Calgary-Buffalo. Madam Speaker, let me begin by saying that I am someone who cherishes the Westminster parliamentary tradition in making sure that the opposition have the opportunity to keep members of government accountable. But sometimes also it can be disappointing that, you wonder whether or not the members opposite have had the opportunity to really look into the bills that were proposed before this particular House and compare those proposals with the current state of the laws as we have them. Let me begin by saying in their commentary on consultation. Madam Speaker, I was clear when I introduced this bill for first reading and second reading that this is actually a request from some of our municipalities. And I went on to mention Edmonton, Calgary, and right there. And yes, we consulted with AUMA as well as the RMA. I personally spoke with both presidents of the Alberta Urban Municipalities Association as well as the rural municipalities of Alberta on this proposed amendment because they came from their colleagues from Edmonton and Calgary and Red Deer. So this is, again, one example where we have taken steps to give municipalities what they ask of us. Number two, Madam Speaker, on 7 days to 90 days, again, if the members opposite have bothered to take a look at Section 4 of the Emergency Management Act that gives the province 90 days, municipalities came to us and says, we would like the same 90 days in a pandemic circumstance. That's exactly what we have done. We have not taken away any right or responsibility or the authority that they have. To the contrary, we have brought them at par with the provincial government. And third, on their commentary around the minister being able to terminate a local state of emergency. Again, if the members opposite have bothered to take a look at Section 22 of the Emergency Management Act, they will find out that the Minister of Municipal Affairs, without this amendment, have got the authority to step in and end a local state of emergency. And so again, that is not new. What we have done is, if there are reasons, and these things don't happen all the time, if there are reasons why the province would want to step in to say, we want to alter local state of emergency without the need to terminate it so that we can do it. If a minister can, if the province can terminate a local state of emergency, for sure a minister in the province can certainly step in to alter those local state of emergency without the need to terminate them. In fact, I would argue that rather than the province step in to terminate when all he needed to do was to modify a little bit, that it is in the municipality's best interest for us to be able to have the flexibility to be able to do so. So again, if the members opposite bother to take a look at Section 18 and Section 22 of the EMA, they will find out that there is nothing that we have proposed here that the municipalities wouldn't welcome. In fact, the Edmonton, Calgary, Red Deer, AUMA, RMA, they welcome this development. And we are at a time when we don't need to worry our municipalities or residents of our communities with the unnecessary interventions. And the more reason why we are providing this flexibility to make sure that they have the time to focus on the things that are important to their municipality. By the way, Madam Speaker, if we don't do this, what it means is that municipalities would have to renew the local state of emergency every 7 days. So every 7 days, council that is focused on having to make sure that they keep their communities and people safe, they will have to renew. I think that was the rationale for them to come to us, not us. They were the ones that says, at this point in time, we need to conserve the time of council, focus their ability to call meetings on important stuff, not.
Are there any other speakers wishing to speak to the bill? The honourable member for Calgary. We're going to go Calgary, Buffalo. Mountain View. Mountain View.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I see another individual waiting to rise, so I'll try to keep myself relatively brief. So I think with respect to this bill, certainly we're in an emergency. We are in unprecedented times, so things are going to move a little bit differently than they normally do, which I think is legitimate. I think it's also legitimate, though, because, if it's our view that it's important to convene the legislature because the legislative body itself is doing important work at this time, then I think one of the principles of that legislative body is that you have a government moving things forward and you have an opposition whose job it is, in my view, to raise legitimate questions, or alternatively to say, yay this, which is a signal to the public as well. But I think that if what we're saying is that this body, the legislature, is critical in this moment, and so we have to come here and we have to be near each other in arguable contravention of some very good advice, then I think we have to assume that all of the functions of the legislature are important in this moment. And so when we ask these questions, we're not trying to be obstinate or ridiculous. It's just that we've had comparatively little time. This bill was introduced yesterday morning. We've had comparatively little time to study the legislation, and more importantly, we've had comparatively little time to speak to those out there in the world who have greater technical knowledge on the legislation. We all in this place speak to legislation all the time, and we are experts to some degree on what legislative provisions do, I think. But we are not experts in everything. And I think one of the most important things about doing your job well is to recognize those things which you don't necessarily know. And in this case, a lot of these impacts are things that we may not necessarily know. And so it is, in my view, our function in this place to go out and to ask those questions of individuals, to get issues, to get to concerns, and to bring those issues and concerns back. And in fact, for members on the government side, I would say that that is their function also. So with that being said, I think the minister had indicated that there were mayors that were in support specifically of the provision around sort of lengthening the time frame of a declared state of emergency. I would be interested to know whether those same individuals have expressed support for the remainder of the substance of the bill, because there are more provisions than just that in here, and specifically who they are. That might actually save us some time in this place if we knew for certain that those individuals had said that. That's very helpful. I think as well, certainly there's been some support from some. The question is there support from all? I mean, the challenging thing being in government and making legislation, the challenging thing is that you're often balancing different interests. And it's often not a question of like this side is right and this side is wrong. It's often a question of these people have legitimate interests and these people have legitimate interests, and they're kind of in conflict. And so how do we balance that, and how do we clear the best path forward, and how do we ensure that everyone gets their needs met, even if they don't get necessarily everything that they want, or at least if not everyone gets what they need out of a piece of legislation, have we engaged in a fair process which enabled everyone to bring those needs and those desires forward. So that's sort of the point that we have to make, I think, around this legislation. And I think it's still legitimate to ask those questions about consultation, about emergency management leadership, and sort of what their take on this was, and if they were even sort of able to engage fulsomely in this. Perhaps this is their advice, and whether sort of municipalities have had a fulsome chance to read the entire legislation, whether they're in support of all elements of the legislation, or what concerns have been expressed. So certainly we're reaching out, we're having those conversations, but those are the questions we're bringing forward, because those are the questions we're having. Even questions as simple as how was 90 days arrived at, right? So going from 7 to 90 is a pretty big leap. There were probably, I would argue, a few steps in between that. Arguably, I don't know. There's probably, I'm not going to speculate as to what the reasoning behind that particular time frame is, because guessing is not generally helpful. So I will just leave it to the government to answer sort of what that was. Certainly we've heard some concern kind of expressed by Democratic experts about the length of time, but maybe those concerns are overruled by other concerns. We're just here to sort of ask those questions. Particularly myself, I'd love to hear if there were experts, particularly from the judiciary, consulted, that sort of thing. So I think there's a lot of those questions. I think my other questions are around why we needed to do this by legislation. I mean, perhaps it's simply that the government thinks it's better to do it by legislation, which in a lot of circumstances it would be. In this circumstance, you're kind of weighing the fact that it's better to do things in a public and transparent way against the fact that we're presently in a pandemic, and we're all kind of gathering together and becoming transmission vectors back to our own communities. So especially in light of the fact that my understanding of Bill 10, which expanded the powers of the government by way of ministerial order from being able to modify or suspend, which I think is one thing, to being able to modify, suspend, or enact provisions in addition to, which to me says a new law. Now, obviously, there has been some legal debate, even as far as Twitter, on whether that difference exists. I never really thought I would find myself arguing the same case as John Carpe and the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, but here we are. He definitely considers that to be an expansion, and that was my reading of the legislation too. He might be a good guy. I've never met him. But we don't generally agree on a great number of things, he and I. So on this one, we do agree, which would suggest at least some validity to that view, that is in fact an expansion. And I mean, my understanding of the expansion is that it is to the point where the government is almost able to write legislation by way of ministerial order. And so I might wonder why we're doing it this way as opposed to another way, though I do understand the perspective that this is a better way because it's a more public and a more transparent way to do that. But again, weighed against the pandemic, I think that's an open question. And so seeing that I have, as usual, spoken for longer than I intended, and knowing that my honourable colleague from Lethbridge, I think, wanted to add some comments, I will take my place and allow him to do that.
Standing Order 29-2A is available. Seeing none, the honourable member for Lethbridge East. Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you very much to the member. I do appreciate the debate on this bill at this time from both the members of Calgary Mountain View and Calgary Buffalo and the questions they've asked. And I would hopefully allow a little bit of time for the minister to respond, possibly later if I don't get to it. But it is my understanding, but maybe the minister can clarify, that this legislation is already limited as it is only enforced during states of local emergency. And that would already create quite a bit of limitation on these powers. On top of that, I would also ask the minister, maybe he can address the fact of the 90 days. If whatever local state of emergency ended prior to that, I would assume, but I would ask for his clarification, that they could also end that state earlier. So it is not enforced for the full 90 days no matter what. It already has limitations in those two regards as well. In the extension from 7 days to 90 days, it would seem reasonable to me, from a common sense approach, that would save approximately 12 meetings every week, basically, to extend that 7 days, particularly in a time of pandemic response that we are in right now. It would make an abundance of sense to me that to eliminate this needless repetitive meeting just to extend this date seems very, very reasonable. The second part, the broad sweeping nature of COVID-19, the way it transmits and the way it spreads and the measures that we've had to take in response to that, I think we need only look to the United Kingdom and having the Prime Minister now in ICU. Because of this, I think it allows for a very, very clear fashion of the order of authority, that many of these councils are 5 or 7, or in the case of Lethbridge, 9 members. And if 2 or 3 or whatever were exposed at any one time, for that power to be directed back to the province, I think is appropriate. I think it's manageable, and I think it sets a clear order of authority that allows for the power to be centralized and moved up the chain of command instead of down the chain of command, so that we have a unified, province-wide response to really very, very significant crises and things of that nature. I think the last point there, just the clarifying that the offense being to defy an order of a state of emergency, I think it's absolutely imperative right now that the public health and safety measures must be adhered to. They must be honored and obeyed by every citizen. That is the only way, in fact, that we'll actually see success against something like COVID-19. And my very, very last comment, Madam Chair, is that just in the last day I have received 2 emails from Lethbridge in their emergency response and their preparedness. And I very much appreciated the Ministry of Municipal Affairs, their openness, their responsiveness to queries and questions from not only myself, but also from members of the City of Lethbridge Council and community organizations. So I find that the communication has been very, very well handled by that office, and I appreciate any comments you might have.
Under Standing Order 29-2A, the Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, my colleague member from Lethbridge East. Those are very correct and accurate comments that you made. And just last night, I had a town hall with at least 400 mayors, reeves, councillors, and chief administrative officers of our various municipalities. And they are overwhelmingly satisfied with our provincial response to this pandemic. And as the Premier rightly stated in his address to the province last night, that it is up to us, the people of Alberta, to make sure that we contain the tide or the spread of this pandemic, shorten the length of time that it will take us, and to effectively, deal with this crisis. It is up to us, and that is part of the reason why we are listening to our municipal partners to make sure that we are doing everything we can to give them the tools that they need to effectively manage within their jurisdiction this pandemic. And the member from Calgary East is correct. What we have done, again, with respect to the 90 days, as I said, it is therefore at the provincial level for a pandemic influenza. It is there. And what we have done is to accede to the request of some of our municipalities, agreed by all of the associations that are responsible for our towns and cities and counties and some of villages, that is the right thing to do. And that's all that we have done. You can imagine that this pandemic, has been going on since January. Some would say since December. And so if we then have to renew every single, in other places of the world, not in Alberta, and that would be onerous on the part of council. Hence, the reason why they specifically asked for this amendment. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Well, Minister, I hesitate to interrupt, but the clock now strikes noon. We are adjourned until 1:30 p.m.